From the First Nations, including the Clackamas, Atfalati, Kayapua, Yamhill, Tillamook, Siletz, Cowlitz, and Malala, until the European settlers who took this land from them by secession orders that were based on racism, and in turn set up their own towns and villages to continue the comfort of white privilege. Laws enacted beginning in 1844 until their final repeal in 1926 excluded all persons of color from this state. And once these were repealed, a systemic system of exclusion was established, not allowing persons of color to own land in Oregon, particularly Portland. We also acknowledge the development and application of systemic racism in policing and the prison industrial complex that disproportionately affects our brothers and sisters of color. We conclude that as the benefactors of this system of privilege, it is our job to overturn it and create a land where, as immigrants, we are all truly welcome and empowered.
Thank you, Pat. Now I'd like to introduce the chairs for our Reckoning with Racism cohort are Elaine May and Mary Smith. Thank you for your leadership, and they've been doing from my perspective at least, they've been doing a terrific job in leading it, and so I really appreciate their efforts in leading the cohort. Thanks to the whole cohort for your work. But I want to turn it out now over to Elaine May, and she'll guide us through the presentations.
Well, thank you for coming. This is the first unveiling of our work, and so we are excited to share it with you. We hope there's not too many bumps as we do that, but if there are, it's because it's the first time that we've all seen this put together in one place. We're going to start with, so we've separated ourselves into kind of 4 groups for 4 different stages of the St. Andrew history, starting with the Native Americans that were here before us, then the settlers, then how the church, Christianity in particular, the Lutheran Church came to this area, and finally St. Andrew itself. And so we've cleverly named each group 1, 2, 3, and 4. And since this is the first time, I'm just going to call out on the number to.
Okay, so would you want me to say click or something?
Yeah, or next.
Okay, so so quickly, that's just what it looks like today. Obviously, go ahead, next. Next. So this just talks basically about the landscape and what was going on before Europeans showed up, and we've got the Missoula floods that came through, and then the eruption of Mount Mazama, which created Crater Lake, and so after these events, the valley more or less takes this current form that we see it now with oak savanna and wetlands. And so here's, basically this is what we're familiar with. And one thing that's really nice environmentally is that there are so many different places across the state that we're seeing people reclaiming the land back to the wetlands and the oak savanna. Next. You can move on from here. So there were a lot of different tribes and many different languages that were spoken in Oregon back before the settlement, before colonization. And a major group was known as the Kayapua. There were 3 major groups of the Kayapua: the Atfalati, and the northern tribes, the central tribes, and the southern tribes. And one thing that I think is really critical to remember when we're talking about the indigenous people or the people of Oregon or even the Kayapua is that just like today, any group of people are incredibly diverse even within themselves. And there's always a tendency that when we talk about Native American tribes where we kind of think of them kind of homogeneously. And
okay, Jim, would you let Matthew know that dinner's ready?
Dinner's ready. Okay, so so one thing that is so they're very, very different, and then you would have like patriarchal tribes and matriarchal tribes and tribes that that stayed in one place and their economy was based on staying in one place, and then you had the tribes that moved around. So important to remember that, because they also, some got along better with with each other than others. And so it was a very, very diverse place, is I guess what I'm trying to make my point here. Next.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. You just got so wrapped up in my story here.
I did. And I was also seeing if I had to meet someone.
Along with, all these different tribes, of course, are all so different, a lot of different languages. When I look at this map here, what I think about is up on the coastal range, the tribes there had a tendency to be fairly well off. We would think of them as being like wealthy people. And if you've gone out there and you visited and gone to some of the museums, you've seen the Flathead Indians. And one reason they looked like that was because they were wealthy enough to enslave others, people from other tribes, and they would shape their heads like that as a sign of their wealth and ability to not have to work as hard because they had this great wealth. And so just like in any other society, we have wealthy people and we have not so wealthy people, and we have a lot of people in between. Next. So the Kayapua as a general group were the main people in our area. And they had words, of course, for the Willamette River and the Columbia River and all these other places. And there's been a movement to change some of the names back to some of the Native American meanings, which is kind of nice. Next. The landscape was a managed landscape, and that's something that also surprises people when we think about Native Americans, that everything was natural, but it's actually in the Willamette Valley was very much managed by the Kayapua. And one thing they did was that they would set the Willamette Valley on fire, and these huge fires, they'd be like horseshoe shaped fires that would just come down the valley. And we did a couple of things. It removed all this excess vegetation. It burned it down to the ground. It also, because it was at the end of the summer, it was like at harvest time, it would force animals, small animals or larger animals, to run from the fire, and it would kind of trap them within this horseshoe, and they would then harvest these animals and then be able to put them aside for the winter, and in that way put food aside, and it would be a continuing thing. There's lots and lots of documentation about these fires from explorers and settlers who came and would see these huge fires going down the valley, and were just amazed by that. Next. And so along with doing that kind of land management, they had lots of different bulbs, farming on the land, basically pulling their food from the land, and their game and the fish, and it was seasonal, and it was replenished, and it was definitely a managed food economy. Next. And here are some of those foods. Next. This is something that Ginny put in here as a seasonal round. You can see that they would move from place to place. And again, some tribes did that, not all tribes did that, but this is one example of a tribe who would do that. Next. The people of the Pacific Northwest has a large and complex trading network. I apologize for reading that directly to you. I try not to do that. Trade, it says they're changed dramatically after the arrival of fur trappers. But to be clear, explorers and traders had been coming to the Oregon coast as early as the 1500s. And so when, for example, Lewis and Clark came in the early 1800s, the Native Americans were not like surprised or puzzled. This was not a change for them. The change really came when people started coming from the East Coast across the country, not coming by ship. Next. And so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because our part was about pre-settlers, but I think there's an important bridge here to get to what happens. So we've got these expeditions going on. A lot of the ones in the 1500s were coming from Spain, and then won't get into that history, but Spain, England becomes the the world power, and so we've started getting other people coming there from other places. They start bringing diseases that all obviously decimate many of the tribes, and malaria and smallpox are two of the main culprits of that. And let's see, next, you can go to next here. And so there's a few laws that really impact the tribes here in Oregon. And there's two, what they called organic laws. There was one of 1843 and one of 1848. And these laid the groundwork to create land titles to Indian land. And it's really important also to recognize that the treaties that were made with the Native American tribes throughout the country, these treaties were made so that this fledgling United States government could be recognized as a government, because you can only be recognized as a government if you are entering into treaties. And so this was an easy way for them as a government to be recognized, because they say, hey, look at us, we're doing treaties. Next. And so they had these land acts, and initially these land acts actually stated that nothing would ever happen to the Indian lands, that they would be held, that they would be for the Indians, respect the Indians, respect the authority of the Indians. This is how the treaties started. Next. But then we come to the Donation Land Claim Act. So there was a lot of things going on the East Coast. There was a depression going on. There was a lot of disease, and people wanted to leave. And also the government wanted to settle the West Coast. And so they created the Donation Land Act, which provided a lot of land to people who would come out and settle there. So you can see that every married white settler would get 320 acres of land. And so all of this, hundreds of thousands of acres of land then is being given to people who would come out and settle and create a farm or just live there, which obviously removes Native Americans. Next. And so they entered into many different treaties. I think there was a total of, at one point, about 7 treaties. And in 1855, there's a treaty that removes them to reservations. And the reservation, let's see, go ahead, next. Starts off as about 61,000 acres that they move them to, the Grande Ronde Reservation. And again, I'm gonna go back to what I was saying, how there was a lot of different tribes with a lot of different cultures, and all of these tribes were assumed to have one singular culture, and they were all put together and sent to a reservation together. So just imagine how that disrupts and the individual cultures of these different people. So the original size was 61,000 acres. Next. There was a Trail of Tears here in Oregon. Also, you've heard of the one back east, but this one also occurred, and you can see the map there, and how these people were forced to walk to the reservation from across the state. Next. And here are a few of those people, some pictures of them. Next. There were not very many jobs there. They were not necessarily farmers. A lot of them were not farmers. That is kind of what they were expected to do, because what else are you going to do on this land that they were given? They were paid very few little rate wages. Next. And then they started to sell off the land. And so I think it talks about the Dawes Act next. If you go next. Oh, sorry, they sent the kids to the boarding schools. Yeah. Next. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, so I missed one there. Let me just stop right there. So there was the Dawes Act, and the Dawes Act split up the land further. And what it did was it created it was a law that said we're going to give some of the land to the Native Americans, but we're going to sell off the excess of the land to any white settler who wants it. And so they split up the reservation. They 234 Native Americans received land, which resulted in about 33,468 acres that they kept in Native American name. And then the excess, what they considered excess, that 25,791 was sold off for $1.10 an acre. And the purpose of the proceeds from the sale of the reservation was intended to, what they said, educate the children of the tribes. And that's where you saw the picture there. Elaine, could you find that again? Right there. And the idea of educating these kids was to take them out away from their families and send them to boarding schools and teach them how to be white. So there's a huge, horribly sad irony there where they give Native Americans this reservation, and then they turn around and they create a law that sells off half of the reservation, with the idea that the proceeds from that sale of this land will basically strip the culture of the Indian children. So that is what I have for life in Oregon before the settlers.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And then we have group 2 to take the story from there.
Okay. Can you see?
We're not seeing your presentation just yet.
Elaine, I can't remember how to find the share button.
It should be on the Zoom screen at the bottom.
Liz, it's green. It says share screen.
Yeah, I'm not.
Like right in the middle of the, like right in the middle.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There. Got it. And then.
Then you pick you select the window that you want to share, and
Yeah.
then you hit share again at the bottom right-hand corner.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Oh. And we even practiced this.
Yes, we
I'm
did, but
feeling better now though.
you were on vacation, and thank you for bearing with us. And now we're seeing the screen.
There we go.
Okay. And let me put it.
In slideshow mode, yep.
How's that?
It looks great, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I am covering the early settlers and landowners of St. Andrews, of the land that we now own. My next arrow goes here. And so this is just a general map. Kristen already went over that the early Europeans exploration of the whole Pacific Northwest. This map, here's Vancouver, just to give you your bearings. Here's Vancouver Island. Here is Puget Sound. Can you see my cursor?
Uh-huh.
And here is Astoria and the Columbia River. So, and the Oregon country, the area that was referred to as Oregon country, and it had extended from the 42nd parallel at the northern edge of Spanish California to the 49th parallel at the southern edge of Russian America, which is now Alaska. So you can see the 49th parallel in the, so it's a huge area, of course. And then the first establishment that was in what is now Oregon was Fort Astoria, and that's going to be down here. And then Washington Territory was split off of the Oregon Territory in 1853. Oregon became a state in 1859. Washington became a state 30 years later. And you can see the shape here that, you know, the current states line boundaries are right about here. This kind of looks like the shape of Idaho, but at any rate, it's kind of interesting the way maps change. So then Kristen talked about the Oregon Donation Land Law. It was in effect from 1850 to 1855, and it underwent several revisions during that time. Prior to this law, the amount of land white males were allowed was 320 acres, with an additional 320 acres allowed to their white wives. So a couple got up to 640 acres prior to 1850. You can see on this, this is a donation land claim map, and here is St. Andrew is located right in here somewhere, and this land was given to Josiah Hall, and this one was Lawrence Hall. And in this next slide, you'll see my arrow. Here's Lawrence Hall, Lawrence and Lucy Hall, and Josiah and Mary Hall. And you can see that Lawrence's land is twice as big. That's because they got their claim prior to 1850. And then in 1850, the amount was cut in half. And so when Oregon donation land law came into effect in 1850, the amount of land allowed for claim was cut in half. And to gain legal rights to the land, they had to occupy the land and improve the land for 4 years. And by 1854, the land could be purchased for $1.25 an acre. Go to the next slide. Here's another, Don really helped me with, he got all these maps for me, so I appreciate Don's help. So you can see here, Lawrence Hall had half of this, and his wife Lucy had the other half, and up here, Josiah Hall and his wife Mary. These stars indicate places where cabins have been found that date back to 1850. And just for your interest, our property is this purple right here. So this little black dot, a square, is our church building. And here's the parking lot, and here's that extra parking area that has the raised beds in it. And then our sanctuary in the firs is back here. So you can see we're between the two donation land claims. So let's see. Okay, the donation law requirements were granted to every white settler or occupant of the public lands, and American half Indians included, above the age of 18, being a citizen of the United States or having made a declaration according to law of his intention to become a citizen. And then I found this interesting too. Before lawmakers voted for the donation land law, they passed legislation authorizing commissioners to negotiate treaties to extinguish Indian title and to remove tribes and, quote, leave the whole of the most desirable portion open to white settlers, close quote. Also, it's noted that Hawaiians were explicitly excluded in the land law. And that's something else. And at one point, Hawaiians made up a large portion of the workforce. I'm not sure how that happened, but they must, I don't know how they got here, but that didn't last very long, and they mostly returned back to the islands before long.
They must have really missed the sun.
Maybe that's it. And see, this is just some information that Dawn found on the BLM website where it's mentioning the log cabins. Let's see, this one also is the same, but I thought it was interesting the way they mark the boundaries. A yellow pine 42 inches in diameter. And then it describes the land, swamp, gently rolling soil. Well, you guys can read it as well as I can. And then we fast forward about 100 years because I couldn't find any information after, what happened to the land after that. So here's my arrow. I lost my arrow. We have to minimize that. There it is. Okay. Here's the official seal of the Oregon Territory from 1848 to 1859. But over here, the Willamette marker, this is interesting. There's a marker called the Willamette Meridian, which was a stake driven into the ground on June 4th of 1851 by Oregon's first Surveyor General. You can see this marker today at the Willamette Stone State Heritage State Park, that's a long name, which is 4 miles west of Portland. This marker established the point from which all land surveys in Oregon and Washington were measured and divided into townships and ranges. And there's a plaque there at the park that reads, beginning here, the Willamette Meridian was established running north to the Puget Sound, south to the California border, And the baseline was established running east to the Idaho border and west to the Pacific Ocean. And then these townships were divided into 6-mile squares. But it's interesting to me that the entire Northwest is measured out from this one marker. And then this next couple of, I went to the county, Washington County, to look up our deed to see who we bought it from. And this is a copy that they made for me. You can see the county made this copy for me, which is really blurry. Okay, so this, you can't tell, but right in here is the description of our plat. Also note down here, there's the seal by this Cedar Hills Company. Also from the county, this is that same description of the plat, but in abbreviations. And so it was really hard to read. So I was able to type it out in a fashion that we could read it. And there's some very interesting things here. One is that apparently we paid $10 for the property. And here's that description: beginning at an iron pipe on the south line, beginning points bear north by 2,189 feet from a stone. So they're measured from stones and trees. And also the measurements, of course, were not as exact as we have to do. Like, for instance, here is 430 feet more or less. All these things say more or less. And then this is the name of who we bought the property from, that I showed you this picture of the seal of. They even had a seal, Cedar Hills. I don't know if that's company or corporation, but it was an Oregon corporation. But I have not been able to find any information about that corporation. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Here, this is when I was at the county looking up trying to find the deed in the microfiche. I took a picture of the microfiche with my iPhone, and here's a copy of that seal. So you can see it was an official company, but it's been really hard to find anything. Also, so the deed says that we bought it from Cedar Hills Company, but also on the microfiche, I found this in really small hand, and this microfiche is all handwritten, so it's really hard to go through it. But this says part of Josiah Hall donation land claim.
Wow.
Even at the county, it says it was part of the donation land claim. So those are my references.
Thank you.
That's about all I can come up with.
That's a lot. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it was.
And so thank you. And then we have group 3.
And so if you'll stop sharing your screen, I'll start sharing mine.
Okay.
And with a little luck, I will get to the right spot. Move you guys down here for a second so I can present. Okay, so in conjunction, in parallel with all of this settling happening, we thought it would be a good idea to look back and see how the Lutheran Church in particular helped establish the systemic racism that is so prevalent in the Northwest and elsewhere. And to do that, we're going to go along with a long-held tradition in the Lutheran Church. We're going to blame the Catholics. It's their fault. And so one fundamental question is, why did explorers believe they were discovering new worlds? I mean, think about it. There were already people here. They were doing just fine, thank you very much. They didn't need our help. They didn't need our malaria for sure. But somehow, you know, they thought they were discovering brand new worlds. And then a better question, why did they feel entitled to those lands? And this mindset is really important as we're thinking about the procedures that were put in place later that kept people of color away from owning land and from finding the American dream in Oregon. So the first thing was the Doctrine of Discovery, the Romanus Pontifex. I did not say Pontifex. My Catholic friends can correct my pronunciation. This was in 1455. So Pope Nicholas V declared that the Portuguese people, the Portuguese could have a monopoly of trade with Africa. So Africa was one of these brave new worlds that nobody had ever seen before, and there were no people there, of course. And so Pope Nicholas said, okay, we'll give that to the Portuguese.
Modest on Japan.
Okay, thanks. And it also authorized the enslavement of local people. So the Pope not only said, you can go in there and take the land, you're in charge of the trade, but you can also enslave the people. Nifty deal. So there's Africa. And then in 1493, not to be outdone, Pope Alexander VI wrote a papal bull called the Inter Caetera that pretty much established Christian domination and superiority in pretty much the rest of the world, or rest of the known world. He left the Far East alone because, you know, you don't mess with China, but all of the areas to the west here. So that included the Americas, Greenland, Australia was always part of this. The important concept is here, not only Christian domination, but superiority. So as early as 1493, Christians were thought to be superior. And then of course the United States, the fledgling United States had to get on the act and came up with the idea of manifest destiny, which was a term that was coined by a journalist actually in 1845. And what this explicitly says is the United States is destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism to the entire world. That's our job. So, oh, there we go. So then here come the Lutherans, right? So in the 1800s, people came to the United States from Scandinavia, Germany, other countries, but a lot of them came from the Scandinavian countries, including, this is a picture of my second great grandfather, Knut. This is Knut Amundsen. He was born in Norway and he died in Primrose County, Wisconsin. This was one of his, I think he had 3 wives, but anyway, that's my great-great-grandfather Knut. And he, like a lot of people in the late 1800s, came to the United States and they settled with other people, other Norwegians, other Swedes, other Danes, other Germans. And they brought their church with them. They wanted to, because they were Lutheran over there and they wanted to be Lutheran over here too, because, you know, why not? And so by 1875, there were at least 75 different Lutheran bodies in the United States. They were defined by country of origin and language. And so you had the Swedish Lutherans, the Norwegian Lutherans, the German Lutherans, and then there were the subsets of all of those. So 75, it was kind of a mess. Now, attitudes toward indigenous people. I'm going to take a little aside here. Because these people, and my ancestors are among them, were so convinced that their job was to conquer these lands and to save the souls of the indigenous people, anybody who happened to live there. A very famous saying was, kill the Indian, save the man. And these folks took that to their heart in every way possible. Now, the good news is I didn't find any evidence that the Lutheran churches ran boarding schools or otherwise had assimilation as a goal. For as much as we can tell, the Lutherans just wanted to come and just be Lutheran. And they weren't necessarily interested so much in bringing a whole bunch of people into the faith. They just wanted to have a place where they could have their potlucks and their language, their hymns sung in their language. But I haven't found any evidence either that the Lutheran Church spoke out against laws and policies aimed at limiting opportunities to white people of European descent. So then the Lutherans came to Oregon. In the 1860s, after Oregon became a state in 1859, and Kristen and Liz talked about this mass migration westward, then the Scandinavians came to Oregon, and with them the Lutherans. The first Lutheran church in Oregon was First Emanuel Lutheran Church in Portland, which was established in 1879. And this is a picture of the first Emanuel Lutheran Church building. It looks different now, but that's what it looked like when they first built it. Scandinavian settlers had come on both the Oregon Trail, so they came from the east, and up the Columbia River from the coast. So they sort of descended in from both directions. Now, one example of a way in which the Lutheran Church in particular, and just white culture in general, has taken advantage of laws and policies and practices and that mindset of we've got to come and develop the people and develop the land. One sad example in our history is Emanuel Hospital. Now, Emanuel Hospital is a good thing. Hospitals are good things. They are necessary things. The difficulty with this is that Emanuel Hospital obtained land in the early 1900s. The Lutheran Church, Emanuel Lutheran Church, got property in the early 1900s that they purchased, acquired, got somehow. And what they needed to do is get rid of those pesky houses that were already there because they wanted to build this hospital, right? And so these are some of the houses in the Albina district that were leveled. The people were kicked out. They may have been offered a little money for them, but certainly not what the property was worth. And they were kicked out and the hospital was built. Now, here's the problem with that. These people were primarily people of color. In Portland, in those days, there were only a few places where people of color could live. It's called redlining. And many of these people had already been kicked out of this area. This was from the Broadway area when Union Station was built. They got kicked out of there because we wanted to have a train station, right? Once again, train station good, pushing people out of their land, not so much. And so these same families got kicked out twice by first the city and then by the Lutheran Church. Emanuel, fortunately, and part of this whole process that we're doing is not to feel overwhelming shame, which is really easy to do because it's like, oh my gosh, my relatives were horrible people. But it's a step toward healing and a step toward what to do in the future differently. So the first step toward that is acknowledging the past before we can embrace the future. Emanuel Hospital now has a permanent display with an exhibit of the houses that were raised, the area, how the area was impacted. The exhibit names names, and it names names not only of homeowners, but of every child forced out with their parents. And Emanuel Hospital is basically saying, this really stinks. We're really sorry that this happened. And we pledge to try to fight for not letting this happen again. So that's how the Lutherans got to Oregon, in a nutshell. There's a lot more. But let's step back into the St. Andrew story with group 4.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So group 4, Mary, take us home. You're on mute, so I'll ask you to unmute.
Mary?
Mary, you're on mute, so you're going to need to unmute.
There.
Awesome.
I'm unmuted. Okay, now. Okay, so yeah, so we're so St. Andrew's story. Now, a lot of us, I was able to find quite a bit of material, and St. Andrew's story has been told in many ways. Tonight, we're going to tell it from a social justice point of view, and so that's, you know, it may look a little different. So from roots to social justice legacy is St. Andrew. Okay, so there we go. Okay. Oh, my picture is in the way. Well, okay. So I'm going to paraphrase Martin Luther King, Jr. And the arc of St. Andrew's moral universe has been long, but it has been bending towards justice over the last 70 years. And as a theme verse, I'm using Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is
Mary, you can move your picture. Just
can I get it? Yeah, I got to move
put
it
your
over
arrow
here.
over
Yeah.
it and just move you out of the way.
I don't have my Bible verse memorized. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Let me see. So maybe I'll put that over in the corner. Okay, and let's see. Okay. Okay, I'm not as good as a lot of you guys. I am going to read directly from the slides in some of these places. Sorry for. St. Andrew was a mission church. The United Lutheran Church in 1952 decided to establish a mission church, and for a while they called it the United Lutheran Church, and it was worshiping at Sunset Valley, which, if you've been around, you know where Sunset Valley Elementary School was, and if you know where Home Depot is, that's where it was. So then in 1953, so not long after, they purchased the property, and we've all heard the people who've been with our church a long time talk about the house church, right? And they actually built two houses, and one was the church, and one was the Sunday school, the school. And here is a picture I found of the house church. Notice the cross on the door. And in 1953, 33 families were our charter members, of whom I think we have maybe one or two, just a handful left alive in our church today, but most of us have at least met a charter member of St. Andrew. And then, so then here's just some notes on this. So all of the charter members of St. Andrew were white, not surprisingly, because all of Cedar Hills community was white. And then over on the right side of the slide, you see this is a quote from the Cedar Hills development restrictions, which said, "Only Caucasians shall use or occupy the properties except in the capacity of domestic servants, chauffeurs, or employees." And that was established in 1946 and stayed with us until after the Civil Rights Act. And then, as you've heard already, Oregon was pretty much almost all white, because when we became a state, we had laws that blacks could not settle here. And so Oregon was mostly white, even as late as the 1950s. So so we built, then we kept growing, and then they purchased the 10 acres on Butner Road, but I didn't know $10, wow. And this picture is from 1978, but they kept, they built the new church building in 61, and then as we grew, additions were made. Then in 1968, there were new laws which made our wetlands not a viable place to build on. And so then we were still adding, still growing, and thinking about what to do. In the meantime, the new sanctuary was built. Here's a picture of our sanctuary. But there was a lot of, I remember we had house meetings and talked for a long time about, should we sell this property and move to another property? But after much deliberation, in 2001, there was a congregational meeting, and we voted to stay where we were. Additional property was purchased over to the side. Later, some of that was sold, but but what's left is like the new part of the parking lot and the community gardens of some of that new property. So I'm looking at, we're going to put this and just move that over a little more. Okay, so as you know, we have our care values for our church, and neighbor care is a big one. And over the years, we've made a commitment to demonstrate our commitment as Christians for social justice. And this has been going on forever, but just some highlights. We're hosting refugees from Vietnam in the 70s, and then bringing it up to the 21st century, hosting the refugee family in Syria. During the discussion time, if anybody wants to add details to these, it would enrich our discussion. Our youth have been involved for years and years in caring for our neighbors. And way back in the early 2000s, groups of the youth went to a Yakima Indian reservation and a Tijuana, Mexico. And more recently on their the youth has been taken to Detroit and Houston and worked with oppressed communities. And then most recently, our Family Promise commitment, where we have sheltered homeless people. Here's a little bit of a timeline of some elements of inclusion and diversity. Our Taiwan Lutheran Church came to St. Andrew in 1992, and off and on we have done some things with them, as you know, some worship services together, some social things together. In 2012, St. Andrew became a Reconciling in Christ congregation, and welcoming the LGBTQ community, and also establishing a welcome statement that all are welcome. 2015, the racial justice team was formed with further education for the congregation, and we had a pulpit exchange in order to form relationships with our Black brothers and sisters in Christ. This pulpit exchange invites pastors of predominantly white churches to preach in a church that is predominantly Black, and vice versa. So they trade. And I don't know how many times we've done that, but I know several of us did that 2 or 3 years ago. We went over and listened to Pastor Mark preach at, and I can't remember the name of the church. It wasn't Maranatha, but anybody remember? But it doesn't matter, I guess. Anyway, it was a church in North Portland, and we had a lovely social hour with them afterwards. And then they came to our church, I think the following week, and their pastor preached in our church.
It was at Maranatha Church, but it wasn't the Maranatha Church.
Right.
That's what it was. It was at the Maranatha building, but they were worshiping there
Yeah,
because their
They
building.
had a fire. and-
Yes.
And relocated to this building.
Yeah. And then more recently yet, in 2017, St. Andrew joined Emerge, which is an immigrant justice organization, and we have participated in peaceful demonstrations and tried to promote education on the issue of immigrants, and also discussing the idea of becoming a sanctuary church. Earth care. I think we're all somewhat familiar of how we have expanded our care for the earth over the years, and especially we've had the lovely opportunity of having the sanctuary of the firs, and we've had a lot of stuff is listed there, but the Earth Care team has been very instrumental in leading us into a lot of good things, such as planting thousands of native plants around our property, and eradicating invasive species, and working with the community on watershed issues, and then leading us into the solar panel project. And currently, as you know, we're doing the community carbon project. Then community care, we have joined MACG. We did that in 2017. And this is a grassroots effort. It's a Portland project, and we are part of it along with many other communities of faith. And by listening to members of the community, we identify needs and then work through social action, community action, to address some of those needs, such as housing, economic equity, immigrant rights, and food insecurity. Oh, just a sec. Why is that not? There we go. So I'd like to quote Lenny Duncan, and some of you know who Lenny Duncan is. He's an ELCA pastor, a Black man. He wrote Dear Church, and in Dear Church he writes, "The reason the ELCA is so white is theological, not sociological. Our theology needs to change if we want our polity to change. We need to actively do what is called white folk work." And he asserts that the church is where the dismantling of racism must begin. And that is the end of my presentation. So stop share.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all those presentations.